I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. In this installment, I'm going to say some things about Jonathan Swift's satire, Gulliver's Travels. So Swift was born in Ireland, and so he counts as one of a really impressive array of Irish writers in British literature. Some of them, like Swift, were really English in Ireland, but they would count as Irish writers. So there's a great tradition of literature, poetry from Ireland that still goes on. He received his BA from Trinity College, Dublin in 1686, a good university, and he aspired to study at Oxford and to have a career in England. So he went to England and received his MA from Oxford University in 1692. And he became an Anglican priest, I think maybe as a kind of a second choice. I think he might have rather have had some sort of a government position, but he took orders as an Anglican priest. And it was surprising to me when I first learned how many priests in the Anglican Church in this tradition were writers. And they didn't always concur with my notion of the righteous and puritanical life of a clergyman. They lived quite robust, active social lives, and they enjoyed material pleasures. Swift might have been one of those, I think. And Swift was active in the early debates of the political parties in England. And this is an important time for politics and the evolution of politics and the free press in England. This is after the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, which really established Parliament solidly as in control of the country. And for the first time, political parties emerged in the open. Before 1688, to have an opposition party would be tantamount to treason. It simply wasn't done openly, and different aristocrats would jockey for political power and influence in the royal court. But only around the late 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century do you begin to have political parties forming, and they took the names Whigs and Tories. And you'll still hear the name Tory today, and maybe sometimes Whigs and Whiggishness. The Whigs, all through history, have been the more progressive party. They would be the ones associated with urban power and mercantile power. The Tories were and are the conservative faction. They would be the party aligned with the conservative Anglicans, with the rural aristocracy, and generally conservative politics, economically and culturally. And Swift wrote for these early newspapers, Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, establishing newspapers, the Spectator paper, the Tatler and the Idler. These were early newspapers, and they emerged at the same time as the political parties, and there was a really robust political culture developing in England, and several things come together. The empowerment of Parliament as opposed to the monarch. Of course, the rising power of the merchant class after the English Civil War. Also, coffee houses. Imported coffee was just being widely introduced in London, coming in from the Americas. And it was a great fad to go to a coffee house and have coffee or tea or chocolate and talk politics in these places. So Swift wrote for the newspapers, and he really became famous for his satires. He's considered perhaps the most brilliant satirist in English literature, writing satirical texts, satirical pieces, criticizing the political factions and the political powers of the day. And he had various political positions himself. He switched parties and would sometimes be writing on behalf of the Whigs and sometimes on behalf of the Tories. But even when he was writing on either side, the readers from the different parties would still read him and enjoy him, even if they were of the party who were being criticized. So he wrote Gulliver's Travels, and it's written in 4 books or 4 separate voyages taken by Lemuel Gulliver, who has been a ship's physician and a ship's captain. He's been at sea various times. And he's writing in a very popular tradition that goes back in England at least to Thomas More's Utopia, but also books like Thomas Coryat's Crudities is one that I kind of enjoy. Coryat's Crudities, Hakluyt's Voyages, another one, all written in the 1590s and early decades of the 17th century. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe would be of the genre as well. These were very popular books written around the time of the discovery of the Americas and the extended voyages from Europe to Asia and the discoveries in the interior of Africa, in which writers would come back and make a lot of money writing about things they had seen on their voyages, things that were quite remarkable. And with some of these voyages, items would be brought back from the Americas. In fact, people, Pocahontas among others, people were brought back and displayed in London and other European cities, returning from these voyages, as well as, of course, lots of gold and silver, and eventually lots of cotton and commodities, including, of course, the enslaved humans. So, as you recall, Gulliver's first voyage was to a place where he discovers an island called Lilliput. And at Lilliput, all the creatures are very small. So he's a giant on that island, and he reports his discussions with the islanders and his observations about them and how he finally escapes. And then he goes on another trip, and he's in Brobdingnag. And in Brobdingnag, everybody's a giant, and he's now very small. And again, he reports about the experiences there. And Gulliver is a kind of a gullible narrator. He's reporting these things without being fully self-conscious, that sometimes he's making a fool of himself, sometimes he's revealing things about himself or about the people he's describing that are not admirable, not attractive features, things that he or the people he's describing would not want to have revealed in this way. All the while, he'll be reporting in honorable terms. He'll be reporting things that, when you look closely at them, may not be so honorable. Then his third voyage, not so much read, he finds a floating island of Laputa. He is describing a floating island of philosophers, making fun of intellectual. And so this floating island is not even connected to Earth. It floats above the sea and floats above terrain below. And the intellectuals, the philosophers who live on this island are so lost in thought that they have to hire minders who will stand by and once in a while poke them with a stick or brush them with a broom-like object in order to shake them out of their deep thought so that they can live a life as one would live. Swift is making fun of these intellectuals and writers and who are engaged in what was called the Battle of the Books, these arguments about philosophy and the good life, and politics and the right kind of a republic, the right kind of a country to have in the 18th century. You would think he had had enough, but he always has the itch to travel, the yearning for new experiences, and so he decides just one last time he'll go out upon the sea. So book 4, here's the scenario. Gulliver's crew mutinies and puts him ashore on an unknown island. The island turns out to be inhabited by the Houyhnhnms, creatures who look like horses, but who are more civilized and intelligent than humans in Gulliver's view. The island also has Yahoos, and Gulliver will initially describe them as a kind of a strange animal, but the more he describes them, the more detail we have, we'll recognize that they are actually humans. He writes, "Upon the whole, I never beheld in all my travels so disagreeable an animal. nor one against which I naturally conceived so strong an antipathy, so that, thinking I had seen enough, full of contempt and aversion, I got up and pursued the beaten road, hoping it might direct me to the cabin of some Indian. I had not gone far when I met one of these creatures full in my way and coming up directly to me. The ugly monster, when he saw me, distorted several ways every feature of his visage, and stared as at an object he had never seen before. Then, approaching nearer, lifted up his forepaw, whether out of curiosity or mischief I could not tell. But I drew my hanger and gave him a good blow with the flat side of it, for I durst not strike him with the edge, fearing that the inhabitants might be provoked against me if they should come to know that I had killed or maimed any of their cattle. Following this closely, his hanger is a sword that he carries by his side. A hanger is the sword that hangs by his side. He has taken out his sword and hit this creature on the side of the head with the flat side of his sword, taking care not to cut it or harm it, because he worries that the lords of this island, the masters of this creature, might be angry with him if he had done serious injury to one of their cattle. Now notice that we haven't caught on yet. He's talking about a Yahoo who is a human being, talking about the creature lifting up its forepaw, standing on its hind legs, and describing it as the cattle of the true inhabitants of the island. In the midst of distress, he writes, I observed them all to run away on a sudden as fast as they could. They've been frightened by something, not him, something else. This time I've skipped some part, but he has been surrounded by these creatures. They're threatening him. He is backed up against a tree with his sword at the ready to defend himself against an attack. I observed them all to run away on a sudden as fast as they could, at which I ventured to leave the tree and pursue the road, wondering what it was that could put them into this fright. But looking on my left hand, I saw a horse walking softly in the field, which my persecutors, having sooner discovered, was the cause of their flight. The horse started a little when he came near me, but soon recovering himself, looked full in my face with manifest tokens of wonder. He viewed my hands and feet, walking round me several times. I would have pursued my journey, but he placed himself directly in the way, yet looking with a very mild aspect, never offering the least violence. We stood gazing at each other for some time. At last I took the boldness to reach my hand toward his neck with the design to stroke it using the common style and whistle of jockeys when they are going to handle a strange horse. But this animal seemed to receive my civilities with disdain, shook his head and bent his brow, softly raising up his right forefoot to remove my hand. Then he neighed 3 times or 4 times, but in so different a cadence that I almost began to think he was speaking to himself in some language of his own. While he and I were thus employed, another horse came up, who, applying himself to the first in a very formal manner, they gently struck each other's right hoof before, neighing several times by turns and varying the sound, which seemed to be almost articulate. They went some paces off, as if it were to confer together, walking side by side, backward and forward, like persons deliberating upon some affair of weight, but often turning their eyes toward me as if it were to watch that I might not escape. I was amazed to see such actions and behaviors in brute beasts, and concluded with myself that if the inhabitants of this country were endued with a proportionable degree of reason, they must needs be the wisest people upon earth. If these horses are this smart, the people on this island must be geniuses. Upon the whole, the behavior of these animals was so orderly and rational, so acute and judicious, that I at last concluded they must needs be magicians, who had thus metamorphosed themselves upon some design, and seeing a stranger in the way were resolved to divert themselves with him, or perhaps were really amazed at the sight of a man so very different in habit, feature, and complexion. Upon the strength of this reasoning, I ventured to address them in the following manner. Gentlemen, If you be conjurers, as I have good cause to believe, you can understand any language. Therefore, I make bold to let your worships know that I am a poor, distressed Englishman, driven by his misfortunes upon your coast, and I entreat one of you to let me ride upon his back, as if he were a real horse, to some house or village where I can be relieved. Well, this is quite an insult to the Houyhnhnms if they only understood him. Unfortunately, they don't understand English. They're not really magicians. They are, in fact, Houyhnhnms. In return of which favor, I will make you a present of this knife and bracelet, taking them out of my pocket. The two creatures stood silent while I spoke, seeming to listen with great attention, and when I had ended, they neighed frequently towards each other, as if they were engaged in serious conversation. I plainly observed that their language expressed the passions very well, and their words might, with little pains, be resolved into an alphabet more easily than the Chinese. Has anyone studied Mandarin? How many characters do you imagine are in the alphabet of classical Chinese? English, we have 24. Classical Chinese, there were 10,000. And even in modern simplified Chinese, there are more than 3,000 characters in the alphabet. Sounds hard to learn, doesn't it? This is just the sort of a language that you would get from one of these travel books, in which the author is pompously presenting himself as now an authority on various cultures across the world and historically. And after examining this language, I think you could resolve it into an alphabet more easily than the Chinese. So it wouldn't take much to resolve a language into an alphabet more easily than the Chinese. It has, as I said, thousands and thousands of characters in the alphabet. So Gulliver arrives at a Houyhnhnm house. These two horses have nudged him along down the road, pushing him, poor guy, with their noses. It's so funny, they push him to a house. Having traveled about 3 miles, we came to a long kind of a building, made of timber, stuck in the ground and wattled across. The roof was low and covered with straw. I now began to be a little comforted, and took out some toys which travelers usually carry for presents to the savage Indians of America and other parts, in hopes the people of the house would be thereby encouraged to receive me kindly. The horse made me a sign to go in first. It was a large room with a smooth clay floor and a rack and manger extending the whole length on one side. So the house has a manger and a rack in it. There were 3 nags and 2 mares, not eating, but some of them sitting down upon their hams, which I very much wondered at, and wondered to see the rest employed in domestic business. These seemed but ordinary cattle. However, this confirmed my first opinion. A people who could so far civilize brute animals must needs excel in wisdom all the nations of the world. The gray came in just after, and thereby prevented any ill treatment which the others might have given me. He neighed to them several times in the style of authority and received answers. So Gulliver finds that in fact there are no people, quote, on this island. There are Yahoos who look like humans but are disgusting and savage and odious, uncivilized. They are brute animals. And that the civilized animals on this island are what we would call horses in England. He is quite a curiosity among the Houyhnhnms, and so they keep him and interrogate him from time to time, and he tries his best to repay their hospitality. So Gulliver is interrogated by the master Houyhnhnm. And one thing we're going to learn about the Houyhnhnms is that they are absolute Platonists. Their society conforms exactly to what we understand from Plato in the Republic. Plato sets out all of the conditions that would be necessary to have a perfect world. For one thing, it would be a world in which there would be no violence and no crime and no suffering and no dishonor. and no poets, only philosophers, because poets necessarily have to lie. What poetry is lying in a certain way. So no poets in the ideal republic, only philosophers. And there would be no lying. And so these Houyhnhnms, they're such absolute Platonic thinkers that they don't even have a word or a concept for lying. When Gulliver says something to them that they think must be not true, must be a lie, even though he's simply describing the way things are in England, they think he's lying, but they don't have a word for it, so they suspect that he is saying the thing which is not. So he answers, Gulliver does, the question, where did you come from? Who are you? What are you? Where did you come from? He says, I answered that I came over the sea from a far place with many others of my own kind in a great hollow vessel made of the bodies of trees, that my companions forced me to land on this coast and then left me to shift for myself. It was with some difficulty and by the help of many signs that I brought him to understand me. He replied that I must needs be mistaken, or that I said the thing which was not. For they have no word in their language to express lying or falsehood. He knew it was impossible there could be a country beyond the sea, or that a parcel of brutes could move a wooden vessel whither they pleased upon water. He was sure no Houyhnhnm alive could make such a vessel, nor would trust Yahoos to manage it. Notice the master Houyhnhnm is already identifying Gulliver himself as a Yahoo, like these other Yahoos, whom Gulliver is disdaining. Must be saying the thing which is not. Houyhnhnms can't make ships like that and move it upon the water. No Yahoo could do that. You must be saying the thing which is not. So he continues in this vein with these interviews and interrogations as the Houyhnhnms learn more about him, what he is and where he came from. Finally, after some time, his clothes are getting so old and kind of dirty, and they begin to fall apart, and they're just rags, and he has to do something about it. So he writes, I have already told the reader that every night when the family were gone to bed, it was my custom to strip and cover myself with my clothes. It happened one morning early that my master sent for me by the sorrel nag, who was his valet. When he came, I was fast asleep, my clothes fallen off on one side and my shirt above my waist. His nightshirt was above his waist, so his genitals are exposed. I was awakened at the noise he made and observed him to deliver his message in some disorder. After which he went to my master and in a great fright gave him a very confused account of what he had seen. The horse has seen his bottom. This I presently discovered, for going as soon as I was dressed to pay my attendance upon his honor, he asked me the meaning of what his servant had reported, that I was not the same thing when I slept as I appeared to be at other times. That his valet assured him some part of me was white, some yellow, or at least not so white, and some brown. Very strange indeed. I had hitherto concealed the secret of my dress in order to distinguish myself as much as I could from that cursed race of Yahoos. But now I found it in vain to do so any longer. Besides, I considered that my clothes and shoes would soon wear out, which already were in a declining condition, and must be supplied by some contrivance from the hides of Yahoos or other brutes, whereby the whole secret would be known. Notice how he just matter-of-factly reports what he's planning to do and how degraded he has become as a human. If we imagine that the Yahoos are humanoid, soon my shoes will wear out and I'll have to make some new shoes using the leather from the hides of maybe some of these Yahoos. One thinks of the Nazis making lampshades. I therefore told my master that in the country from whence I came, those of my kind always covered their bodies with the hairs of certain animals prepared by art, as well as for decency, as to avoid the inclemencies of air, both hot and cold, of which, as to my own person, I would give him immediate conviction if he pleased to command me, only desired his excuse if I did not expose those parts that nature taught us to conceal. Nature has taught us to conceal our genitals ever since the disobedience in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve ate the apple and were ashamed all of a sudden of themselves and got some fig leaves and sewed themselves some coverings. He said my discourse was all very strange, but especially the last part, for he could not understand why nature should teach us to conceal what nature had given. That neither himself nor family were ashamed of any parts of their bodies, but however I might do as I pleased. Whereupon I first unbuttoned my coat and pulled it off. I did the same with my waistcoat. I drew off my shoes, stockings, and breeches. I left my shirt down to my waist and drew up the bottom, fastening it like a girdle about my middle to hide my nakedness. So, all this my master very graciously consented to. Thus the secret was kept till my clothes began to wear out, which I was forced to supply by several contrivances that shall hereafter be mentioned. From thenceforward he doubled the pains he had been at to instruct me. He brought me into all company and made them treat me with civility, because, as he told them privately, this would put me into good humor and make me more diverting. Notice how gullibly Gulliver reports something that is disrespectful to him. He's got the Stockholm Syndrome, where people who are kidnapped or held hostage after some time may begin to identify with and take on the values and perspectives of their captors. So, the Stockholm Syndrome was not understood until the 20th century, but Gulliver certainly has it, I think. So, Gulliver has learned the language, and he begins to describe to the master Houyhnhnm the conditions of horses in Europe. And this is a very delicate topic here, because he's got to describe how horses are treated in Europe, and they're not treated as well as these horses would like to be treated. When I asserted that the Yahoos were the only governing animals in my country, which my master said was altogether past his conception, he desired to know whether we had Houyhnhnms among us, and what was their employment. I told him we had great numbers, that in summer they grazed in the fields, and in winter were kept in houses, with hay and oats. When Yahoo servants were employed to rub their skins smooth, comb their manes, pick their feet, serve them with food, and make their beds. He's leaving out some things, right? And employing some euphemisms here, I think, to make it sound like the humans are the servants of the horses. And so the master says, well, I understand you well, said my master. It is now very plain from all you have spoken that whatever share of reason the Yahoos pretend to, the Houyhnhnms are your masters. I heartily wish our Yahoos would be so tractable. Now, Gulliver has to disabuse his master of this positive appreciation of Yahoos. Yahoos are not what you think. I begged his honor would please to excuse me from proceeding any farther, because I was very certain that the account he expected from me would be highly displeasing. But he insisted in commanding me to let him know the best and the worst. He should be obeyed. I owned that the Houyhnhnms among us, whom we call horses, were the most generous and comely animal we had, that they excelled in strength and swiftness, and when they belonged to persons of quality, employed in traveling, racing, or drawing chariots, they were treated with much kindness and much care, till they fell into disease or became foundered in the feet, and then they were sold and used to all kind of drudgery till they died. after which their skins were stripped and sold for what they were worth, and their bodies left to be devoured by dogs and birds of prey. But the common race of horses had not so good fortune, being kept by farmers and carriers and other mean people who put them to greater labor and fed them worse. I described as well as I could our way of riding, the shape and use of a bridle, a saddle, a spur, and a whip, a harness, and wheels. I added that we fastened plates of a certain hard substance called iron at the bottom of their feet to preserve their hoofs from being broken by the stony ways on which we often traveled. My master, after some expressions of great indignation, he wondered how we dared to venture upon a Houyhnhnms' back, for he was sure that the weakest servant in his house would be able to shake off the strongest Yahoo, or by lying down and rolling on his back, squeeze the brute to death. So that's the story. Doesn't make sense to the Master Houyhnhnm. I think that's a good place to stop today, and I'll try to remember this point when we come back on Wednesday. Any questions on any of this? With that, I'll conclude this webcast. I'll return to Book 4, Gulliver's Voyage to the Land of the Houyhnhnms, in another webcast. Until then, if you have questions or comments, please don't hesitate to send me an email.